This is my seat. I don't care what your ticket says. Go back where people like you belong.
No, this is my seat. I don't care what your ticket says. Go sit in the back where you belong. The words sliced through the quiet hum of boarding chatter like a knife. Heads turned. Passengers froze. A white woman, impeccably dressed in a cream designer suit, stood with her manicured hand gripping the headrest of 2A in first class. Her voice dripped with entitlement, sharp enough to cut the air, and before her stood a tall black man in an elegant but understated navy suit. Ticket in hand, his brows raised not in anger but in disbelief. Whispers rippled down the aisle. Some passengers hunched lower into their seats, pretending not to hear. Others leaned closer, hungry for confrontation. The attendants at the front stiffened, unsure whether to intervene. The man took a slow breath, his deep voice calm but resolute. "Ma'am, this is my assigned seat." 2A, boarding pass confirms it. The woman scoffed, her pearl earrings bouncing as she shook her head. "Please, do you really expect me to believe you paid for this? Seats like these aren't meant for cleaners or whatever it is you do. Now move!" Gasps fluttered through the cabin like startled birds. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two. The attendants hesitated, caught between their training to de-escalate and the icy confidence radiating from the woman. But the black man did not flinch. He simply studied her, quiet, unshaken, as though her words were nothing but noise. His calmness, in fact, seemed to rattle her more than if he had shouted. Finally, he spoke again. "Are you certain you want to continue this, here, in front of everyone?" His tone was steady, even gentle, yet there was a weight behind it. A quiet authority that made even the attendants glance twice at him. The woman smirked. "Oh, what are you going to do? Call the manager? You don't belong here. Sit in coach where people like you sit. This airline doesn't need freeloaders pretending they can afford first class." Laughter, nervous, awkward, bubbled from a couple of passengers nearby. Others looked away, shame or fear written across their faces. Nobody stepped in. Not yet. And then, with deliberate grace, the man lowered his boarding pass onto the armrest of the disputed seat. He looked her directly in the eye and said 6 words that made her breath catch in her throat. "Ma'am, I own this airline." The silence that followed was deafening. Every pair of eyes in first class snapped back to him. Even the flight attendants froze, blinking as though they hadn't heard correctly. The woman's smug expression faltered, cracking under the weight of those words. "You... what?" she stammered, her voice suddenly thinner, less certain. But he didn't repeat himself. He simply eased into 2A, his presence commanding without effort, his gaze fixed calmly ahead, as if her insult had been nothing more than a passing breeze. Passengers who had been watching now sat straighter, whispering behind hands. The attendants exchanged looks, suddenly realizing the gravity of what had just unfolded. The white woman remained frozen by the aisle, her face pale, her lips parting and closing with no words finding their way out. In a matter of seconds, her arrogance had turned to disbelief. And for the first time since she boarded, she seemed small, because she had just discovered that the man she tried to humiliate wasn't just another passenger. He was the very reason this flight and this airline existed. And the story was only beginning. The murmurs in the cabin had grown into a full-blown hum of disbelief, but the woman in seat 2A remained unmoved, her posture sharp as a blade. Passengers whispered into their champagne glasses. Others nudged each other with the subtle thrill of scandal. She had snatched a seat in first class. Not just any seat, but one reserved for a man she thought was beneath her. And the man, a tall black gentleman, dressed in understated elegance, a tailored charcoal suit, polished leather shoes, his expression calm but piercing. His eyes carried the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command the entire room. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said carefully, wringing her hands as though she knew this was spiraling into something bigger than just a seating dispute. "This seat it's already reserved." The woman crossed her arms, flashing a tight smile that reeked of entitlement. "Reserved? For him?" she scoffed, tilting her chin toward the man standing a few feet away. "You must be joking. I paid for this ticket, and I'll sit where I deserve." "Don't waste my time," gasps rustled through the cabin. A man in the back muttered, "Did she just say that out loud?" Someone else shook their head in disbelief. The black man didn't flinch. He didn't argue, didn't bark back. Instead, he took a measured step forward, his presence alone enough to make the air feel heavier. "It's not about deserving," he said, his voice low, deep, and commanding, every syllable laced with quiet fire. "It's about respect, and you've just shown you don't understand it." The woman laughed, though her laughter wobbled like thin glass. "Respect? Please, don't lecture me about respect. I've been flying first class since before you could afford a bus ticket." The words sliced through the cabin, sharp, venomous. Every passenger froze. Phones tilted discreetly, cameras rolling, the weight of history pressing against the walls of that aircraft. The man studied her, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, though his composure never cracked. He leaned toward the flight attendant, his tone suddenly professional, almost chillingly calm. "Go ahead," he instructed softly. "Check the manifest. See who's supposed to be in 2A. The attendant, beads of sweat forming at her temple, scurried away toward the front galley where the passenger list was held. In that silence, the woman decided to double down. "I don't care what the list says. This airline is run by people who understand who belongs where. And trust me," she sneered, "it isn't him." A few passengers gasped audibly, some shaking their heads in disgust. The tension swelled like a storm cloud about to split open. Then, the attendant returned, her face pale, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. She held the manifest like it was a verdict. "Sir," she whispered, looking at the black man with something akin to reverence. "You are, indeed, the one assigned to 2A. No mistake." All eyes swung to the woman, whose smirk faltered for the first time. But before she could launch another protest, the man spoke, his voice resonant enough to silence the entire cabin. "I wasn't going to say anything," he began slowly, deliberately. "I was going to let you sit, let this flight pass quietly. But then," he paused, his gaze cutting straight into hers, "you decided to humiliate me in front of everyone. And that I will not ignore." The woman blinked, her bravado wobbling under the weight of his words. You can't talk to me like that. I know the owners of this airline personally. I could have you thrown off this flight in minutes." A ripple of incredulous laughter swept through the first-class cabin. Passengers were shaking their heads now, some even chuckling in disbelief. They sensed what was coming but waited, riveted, unwilling to blink. The man straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with quiet precision. "Is that so?" he said softly, almost amused. "You know the owners?" He leaned forward just slightly, his eyes boring into hers. "Then allow me to introduce myself properly." The woman's lips parted, her confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. What do you mean?" He exhaled slowly, the silence stretching until it snapped like a taut string. "I am the owner," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of truth and the echo of absolute authority. The cabin erupted. Gasps, whispers, jaws dropping in disbelief. Someone in the back said loudly, "No way! He owns Sky Vista?" Another voice confirmed, "That's David Cole, Sky Vista Airlines' CEO." Phones tilted higher now, capturing every flicker of the woman's unraveling composure. Her skin drained of color, her lips trembled as though every ounce of arrogance had been sucked out of her in a single breath. You're him?" she stammered, her voice cracking. David Cole, calm, composed, devastatingly in control. nodded once. Yes, and you've just made the mistake of insulting not just a man, but the very person who built this airline you're sitting on. The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers stared, waiting, wondering. What would he do next? Would he humiliate her in return? Would he kick her off the plane? The tension clung to the cabin like static, every second stretching into eternity. The woman sank back into her seat, her body trembling, her eyes darting toward the door, as though escape were still possible. But there was no escape. Not from the truth, not from the cameras, not from the sheer gravity of her arrogance collapsing under its own weight. And then, David's eyes flicked toward the captain, then back to the passengers. His voice cut through the air. Steady. Resolute. We will not take off until this matter is addressed properly. Respect is not negotiable. Not here, not anywhere. The audience, every passenger on that plane, was hooked, their hearts thudding, their breaths shallow. What would happen next? Would she be removed? Would the flight continue? The rising storm had reached its peak, and the cabin waited, breathless, for the thunderclap to come. The cabin was so silent that even the hum of the air conditioning sounded like thunder. The white woman sat rigid in seat 2A, her knuckles pale as she gripped the armrests, her earlier arrogance dissolving into trembling silence. Around her, the first-class passengers leaned forward, wide-eyed, phones recording, unable to look away from the storm that had settled into this plane. David Cole, the man she had mocked and dismissed, stood tall, his gaze unshakable. His voice had been calm before, but now it carried an edge sharp enough to slice through the heavy air. "You wanted to make a spectacle," he said evenly, his eyes locked on hers. "Congratulations, you've got one." Her lips trembled. I didn't know," she stuttered, her voice stripped of its earlier venom. "If I had known who you were, I never would have—" "Stop." His single word halted her mid-sentence. He leaned down, close enough that only she could hear the weight of his words. "That's exactly the problem. Respect isn't reserved for the powerful. If you only treat people with dignity when you know their titles, then you don't understand respect at all." The entire first-class cabin erupted in murmurs. Heads nodded. Some passengers clapped under their breath, as if affirming the truth they had all just heard. The woman shrank in her seat, her face drained of its haughty confidence. But David wasn't finished. Straightening, he glanced toward the captain, then the attendants. "This flight won't move until we deal with this," he announced, his voice carrying across the cabin like the gavel of a judge. The lead flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, what would you like us to do?" David turned back to the woman, his eyes steady, his jaw firm. "You tell me," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Do you think you deserve to stay here? To sit in a seat you tried to steal, after humiliating another passenger, after humiliating yourself?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her arrogance had been a fortress moments ago, but now it was rubble beneath his words. She finally whispered, barely audible. "No." "No," David repeated, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. He let the silence hang, every passenger holding their breath, waiting for the final blow. Then he moved, calmly, decisively. "You will leave this seat. You will be escorted back to economy, where the ticket you actually purchased belongs, and you will apologize to every passenger who had to witness your performance today." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers sat straighter, watching as the woman's humiliation grew unbearable. "Economy?" she croaked, as though the word itself was poison. David leaned closer, his eyes unblinking. "Or," he said softly, "you can step off this flight right now." "Your choice." The woman froze. Passengers craned their necks to see her decision. Her pride battled visibly with her fear. The same pride that had led her to snatch a seat that wasn't hers, to insult a man she thought powerless. But the balance had shifted. She knew she was trapped. Finally, trembling, she whispered. I'll go to economy." The entire first-class cabin exhaled at once, the tension bursting like a bubble. A few passengers clapped softly. Others shook their heads in disbelief at how far she had fallen in mere minutes. "Good," David said firmly, straightening his suit jacket as though sealing the verdict. "Then stand up." The woman's legs shook as she rose, her once proud figure now hunched and small. She glanced at the passengers, her eyes darting desperately for sympathy, but all she saw were cold stares, judgment, and the glow of camera phones recording every step of her downfall. The flight attendant stepped forward, gesturing her toward the back, but David's voice stopped her mid-step. "The apology," he reminded coldly. The woman flinched, her face burning. Slowly, awkwardly, she turned to the passengers and whispered, I'm sorry." "Louder," David commanded. Her eyes darted wildly, but she obeyed. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice cracking, audible enough for everyone to hear. The cabin fell silent again, the weight of her humiliation cemented forever in the minds and phones of every witness. Satisfied, David gave a short nod. "Now go." With that, the once arrogant woman shuffled down the aisle, escorted by attendants. Passengers whispered behind cupped hands, phones capturing her walk of shame. Some shook their heads, others muttered, "She deserved that." When she disappeared into economy, the cabin felt lighter, as though a storm cloud had finally passed. David turned back to his fellow passengers, his voice calm once again. "I apologize for the disruption," he said, bowing his head slightly. "This airline stands for dignity and respect, and that will never change, not while I'm here." Applause erupted, genuine, thunderous applause. First-class passengers clapped, some even stood, others cheered. The tension had broken, replaced by admiration for the man who had just turned arrogance into ashes. David sat finally in seat 2A, his rightful place, adjusting his cufflinks with quiet composure. The flight attendant placed a glass of champagne on his tray with trembling hands, whispering, "Mr. Cole, that was incredible." He offered her a faint smile. "Not incredible," he corrected softly. "Just necessary." As the engines roared to life and the plane taxied down the runway, the passengers couldn't stop buzzing. They knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. An arrogant woman's collapse, a CEO's quiet dominance, and a lesson that respect isn't about titles, but humanity. And though the flight continued like any other, the story of what had happened in seat 2A was already airborne, carried not just on whispers, but on every phone, every recording, every witness who would replay it for the world to see. For the woman, it was a humiliation she would never escape. For David, it was another quiet battle won. And for every passenger on that plane, it was a moment etched into memory forever. The moment power met arrogance, and dignity won. The applause lingered in the cabin long after David had settled into his seat. For most passengers, the flight would have been just another trip, another few hours in the air before reaching their destination. But today, they were part of something unforgettable, something that reminded them that arrogance has a cost, and dignity always finds a way to rise. The woman, who had once strutted into first class, now sat hunched in the very back of the plane, crushed between two strangers, her face pale and eyes red from humiliation. She had been stripped of her power not by shouting or aggression, but by the calm authority of the man she had mocked. Every few minutes, she could feel the stares of passengers who turned around to sneak a glance at her, and each time shame burned hotter in her chest. Meanwhile, in 2A, David Cole leaned back in his seat. The weight of what had just happened pressed on him, but not in regret. No. This was why he had built Sky Vista Airlines. He had grown up watching his community struggle with discrimination, forced to prove themselves twice over just to be acknowledged. His dream wasn't just to run an airline, It was to build a space where every passenger felt equal, regardless of skin color, wealth, or status. Now, sitting in the very seat he had been denied, he realized this incident wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reminder of why he fought so hard for the company's values. Across the aisle, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered loudly, "that man, he owns the whole plane." His mother smiled softly and bent down to him. "He owns the whole airline, sweetheart. All the planes." The boy's eyes widened, darting toward David. "Wow, he's like a superhero," the mother chuckled. "Yes, but not because he owns it. Because he stood up when it mattered." David overheard. A faint smile touched his lips. He hadn't intended to become a symbol today, but sometimes symbols choose you. As the flight continued, the mood in first class transformed. Passengers who had sat in stiff silence at the start now chatted with each other, voices light, conversations buzzing with what they had just witnessed. One elderly man leaned across the aisle toward David. "Son," he said warmly, "I've flown a lot of miles in my life, but I'll never forget this one." Another passenger added, "You handled that with dignity. The way you spoke, it wasn't just about her. You reminded all of us of something important." David inclined his head respectfully. "I only did what anyone should do when faced with arrogance. But I thank you." Even the flight attendants seemed transformed. They moved with renewed energy, their nervousness replaced with admiration. The lead attendant quietly approached David again, kneeling slightly so her voice wouldn't carry. "Mr. Cole, I just want to say thank you. We see things like this more often than people realize. But today, you gave all of us courage." David's eyes softened. "Courage isn't about power," he said gently. "It's about refusing to look away." When the plane landed hours later, the story didn't stay trapped inside those walls. As the passengers disembarked, phones buzzed, videos uploaded, tweets and headlines spread like wildfire. By the time David stepped into his waiting car, the clip had already gone viral. "Arrogant woman demands black man leave first class. He turns out to be the airline CEO." The video was everywhere. News channels, social media, blogs. Millions watched, shared, and commented. Some condemned the woman's arrogance, others praised David's composure. But most agreed it was a lesson the world needed to see. For David, however, it wasn't about going viral. It was about the boy who called him a superhero, the passengers who rediscovered respect, and the flight attendants who felt braver because of him. That was the true victory. As he looked out the tinted window of his car, city lights glowing in the distance, David whispered to himself, "Respect must never be optional." And with that, he knew the skies he commanded would remain a place where dignity soared higher than arrogance, forever.